My name is Jensen. Let's learn some UiPath. Today we will see how we can get started with the UiPath REFramework. The REFramework is nothing but a template that we can use to build our robots in. It has the huge advantages that we can reuse our components, that we can do exceptional error handling, that is when our robot goes down, hopefully not that often, but then it can easily recover and retry. Also, we have exceptional audit and logging abilities. So let's create a process, and by the end of this use case, you'll be able to build your own UiPath REFramework workflows. So click the Robotic Enterprise Framework here. We could call it something. I'll call it my REFramework use case. Then we'll click Create. Click Open Main Workflow, and this is the UiPath REFramework. It's a state machine layout, and a state machine is nothing but the name of these state. So before we dive into the REFramework, let's talk a little bit about what a state machine is, as it is an important concept of the REFramework. So click New, then we'll click Sequence. Here we can call it something, X1, and then we'll click Create. We have a sequence here. So go to your activities and then search for a state machine. The state machine that consists of a scope, that is the state machine. Let me drag that in and expand it. Here you can see the start. Then we can drag a number of states in. We can connect these two here. We can drag in another state. Let's put it here. And a state machine must have a final state. So then we can drag it over here and connect these two. So now we have created our state machine layout. We can run it, nothing will happen as it will just run through. Like this. However, let's try to open up a state. In a state we have an entry that will be performed in the beginning. Then we will have a transition. And if I go back to the state machine layout, you can see that the transition is here. So we can put in a trigger or a condition that needs to be met before it will run to the next state. So before it will run from this state to this state, this condition or trigger has to be met. However, we don't have to. So if we put nothing in the condition and the trigger, then the state machine will automatically go here. Let me open up the first state again. Before that exits, we will perform the action here in the exit. We will not use this block a lot, so I won't go deep into that. Let me go back. Let's try to create a simple state machine flow. So I'll go in here. Then we will have an input dialog. We will ask the user for a name. Here, and drag it in. The title, well, there's just nothing. And here we can say, please put in a name, like this. We will store the result in a string. So go over here, Control K, str, name, like this. Then we go back to the state machine layout, because now we want to check if this name starts with an A. So open up the transition here. So that's a condition. So it's a condition on our str name. We will use the .NET. So we'll say starts with. By the way, if you want to learn this coding language, I can recommend the book Learning Visual Basic.NET. There will be a link to that book in the description below. So starts with parentheses, quotation mark, A. This is the condition. Then we'll go ahead. So if the name starts with an A, then we'll go over here. Here we can just do something like a silly little message box. We'll put that in here. And we can say something like the name starts with an A, like this. We can go back to the state machine. And so let's say that we are up here and the name starts with everything else than an A, then we are stuck up here. Nothing will happen because this condition is not met. So we can put in another connection here over to the final state. However, we need to fill in this condition because when we have one condition, we need to fill in everything. Here we could leave it empty because there's only one transition away from the state. So go up here to the T3, and similarly we can just say strName dot starts with, then we'll say A, and because this is not true this time, so we can just say false, that is the condition. So now we created a simple name checker in a state machine layout. Let's try to run it. Here, put in a name. Let's put in my name first. That is Anders. We'll click OK. The name starts with an A. That's correct. We click OK, and the workflow is done. Let's run it another time. And we can put in Bill, like this. OK. Nothing will happen because we made it to this transition. So this is basically what a state machine layout and what transitions are. Now we get that sorted. Let's go back to the main. So like you saw before, we start here, then we move to the initialization. We can have two transitions away. We can have a system exception and a successful. In our initialization, I'll open it a bit. That's where we initialize all our systems. That could either go wrong, then we go over here in the end, or it can go right, so we move down here. If we move down here, we will get the transaction data from our orchestrator queue. We will get back to that. However, we'll get it one by one. This one can have two outcomes as well. We can have no data on the queue, then we'll just move over here in the end process. Or we can have at least one new transaction on the queue, then we'll take one and move down here. Here we will process the transaction. That's where we can type something into our system or anything. This will have three outcomes, three transitions. We can have this one, let me move it a little bit ahead. We can have a system exception, that is if our system fails. That's not usually very good, so that will go up to the init again, where we try to initialize the systems. Or we can have two outcomes. If it goes well, we can have success and business exception. A success is obviously when everything is fine and the data is good. A business exception is where our systems, they're okay, but it breaks a rule. That could be if we have some wrong data from the client, then we will make a business exception. So if we have a success or a business exception, then we'll move up here and get the next transaction. So if there's a new transaction, we'll move down here and this loop. Finally, we won't have any more transactions and we will take the no data and move to the end process. That's basically what this is. If we go over to the project, we can see some folders and our main. Our main is just this here. The X1, I just created that. We can see some other folders and a config. If we move into framework, we can see some already created workflow for us. Let me collapse this. So the first thing that we will talk about, that's the config. It's an Excel sheet. You can either find it here or in the folder system for this project. I'll just open it here. I've opened up both the case Excel sheet and the config. Let me minimize the case as we will get back to that. I'll drag it in here. So the config sheet, that's very important because that's where we store our config. The first thing, move to settings. We can define our orchestrator queue name. And if you haven't connected the orchestrator to the UiPath, that's important that you do that. Click the link in the upper right corner to configure that. If you have done it, just continue. So we can define the name of our queue here. We will not touch the constants here and the assets. That could be value that will change, like a folder or a URL or something. So we will configure our config sheet in a few minutes. The first thing that we'll do is to go to our browser, then we will go to our orchestrator and we will log in like this. We will click queues and we will create a new queue. So we'll click plus here and we can call the queue something. I'll call mine capitals and we will not touch anything else here. We'll just say add. And we can see our queue here called capitals is indeed created. We could right click these three dots here and click view transactions. There's nothing to show as we haven't added anything to the queue. So if we want to create like 10 cases in the system, we will add 10 items to this queue. Let us go back to the config sheet because now we created a queue called capitals. So we'll open up the config, go to settings. Instead of process ABC queue, that's not our queue name. Our queue name was capitals. So this config sheet will tell our UiPath REFramework that it is the name of the orchestrator queue and just automatically get it. Another thing that we will do is to create an asset. So go to your orchestrator again, click assets. Here we will create an asset. We could just call it URL. It will not be the most advanced URL, but imagine that this could change a lot, so it will be handful to have it here in your asset. That could be a simple one, so under text, put in Google. Then we'll click create. If you want to do credential handling, we need to spice up this setup a bit. Click the video in the upper right corner to go to credential creating. However, now we created an asset and we call it URL. So we go back to the config sheet. Here we go to the asset. We don't need to fill in everything here in the CRD, but we should just put in the name of the asset. That's the URL. We could either type it in here, that's where we will refer to it. So we could say URL, or we could just say maybe Google URL if we want that. It doesn't matter. This one will call to Orchestrator and it will store it under this name. That's it. We're done with the config sheet. So click save. Then we'll click close. Now we go back to the REFramework. So at first sight, this looks very easy. However, when we open up here, we can open the init. We can see that we have some invoked workflows here. So, and here we can go down. There's a whole bunch of settings and invoked workflows and whatnot. Don't get overwhelmed. We will not use a lot of them as they will just be standard settings, so let them be. We will touch only the important ones and then we can get back to the more advanced settings. So close this one down again, then go to main, go to the outer main. So here in the initialization, we will read the config Excel that we just created and we will launch our used applications. So open the initialization and it will look like this. Remember, we opened this one before. So the first run, let me expand this. We will not touch a whole lot as this will just be where we init our settings. We can open the workflow. Here, we can see here that we read our config sheet, and the only important thing that you need to know is that we will create an argument that will be called outConfig. It will be a dictionary with a key value string object. That is, you will look up a string that could be the Google URL, and then you will get something out like an object. In our case, it will just be the name of the URL, but it could be everything else. So the config, you can see it as a dictionary, as it is, but a dictionary of your REFramework. That's where you store all your data in. And do you know what an argument is? If not, then watch this. I again click a new sequence. I'll call this x2 as this is the second example. So then click create. Here we have our workflow. Again, we will take on an user's input. So drag in an input dialog here. And I'll just say type in a number. Remember, it should be in quotation marks. Like this. I'll store the variable over here, Control K, int number, like this. I'll go down to variables because we'll need to change it to an integer, like this. Then I'll just do a simple calculation. So I'll go up here, drag in the right line, and I'll just say parentheses, int number plus 100, then parentheses end to string. So this one does nothing that add 100 to the user input number, and then it will print it out in a right line. Let's run it. Here, so I'll type in 5, click OK, and in the output window down here, we can see that we have added 100. Nothing fancy about that. However, let's click a new sequence, and here we will say x2a, as this will be our invoked workflow where we will use arguments. So click create. So this is just another workflow here. And what we'll do here is that we'll drag in an assign. We will create two arguments. You can see an argument as the same thing as a variable. It's just a variable that can pass in and out of workflows. So here we'll just create two arguments. We will have an incoming argument, that is that it will come into this workflow. So we will prefix it with in underscore, and it will be the int number. Then we will have the direction in, that's fine. The argument type, that will be an integer. We will also create an outgoing argument, so out. Then we can call it int result, like this. And the argument type will be an integer, like this. So up here in the assign, we will assign something to the outgoing argument, outgoing int result here. What will that be? That will just be our ingoing integer plus 100, like this. So we just did the calculation in here, and I'll click save. What we can do now is go back to our x2a, and we will create another variable called int result. Like this. That'll be an integer as well. Go to your project. Now we can see our x, ex2 and ex2a. Remember, this is ex2, and the one where we did the calculation was the ex2a. So we can simply just invoke this ex2a into our ex2. That goes like this. We just drag it in here, and we invoked it. Now we just need to map the arguments. Remember the int number that will go in here? We can now click the import arguments. We can see that we have an ingoing argument called int number. That will just be our number that we got from up here. So in the value, we just type in int number. That one will be mapped to here. So the user will give an input int number, and it will go in here as an argument. The other argument, that's the out int result. So remember to change the direction to out. That one will come out of this workflow, and it will be stored into the int result like this. Then we'll click OK. Now we can go down here in the right line and simply just write out the int result. So let's recap. We have an input dialog here. The user type in a number that will be stored into an integer. Then we have this invoked workflow where we do the calculation. Open workflow here. Then, let me go back here. Then we will take the int number in here, do the calculation, spit out a int result, and we will map it into the int result over here, and we'll write it out. So do a ToString here, that will write it out. Another important thing is that open up the workflow and go to arguments and ensure that this is direction in, that's the default. However, the result will go out, so change the direction to out, like this. And we can click save, and we can run this workflow. Here, we will put in 8, we will run it. We can go to output, and we can see that we indeed have done the calculation in the invoked workflow. That's how arguments work. So let's get back to our main, and we can close these things down. So now we talked about two important concepts of the REFramework, that is the state machine and the arguments. We can open up the init here. So here we will do nothing. We will just know that if we open up this workflow here, we will read our config. We will read that into our dictionary. We can also see that we get the assets from the orchestrator further down and so forth. Nothing to see. We will close it down like this. Here we could kill all processes. That is, if we have some systems open that we want to kill first, let's just leave it, but it's empty. But you could have something like close down a browser, close down your CRM system, so you know that it will start up like the way you want. Then we can go down to Init All Applications. We can open up the workflow. That is, we could, for example, open up a browser. And in our case, let me describe the case here. We just have an Excel sheet. We have ID and name. We want to do a Google search of the capital in Denmark, USA, and India. That's our case. It's very simple, but it's nice to understand the REFramework. We can indeed later on do a lot more advanced. If you want a full guide to this REFramework and all the settings, my colleague Jan and I, we have created an entire advanced UiPath REFramework guide where we will cover all settings. That is, everything that's in here we will cover. It's on Udemy, and if you click the link in the description, you'll be getting a discount. I think it will be around $15, but it's well worth it. It's the best course that we ever built. But let's get back here. You will easily be able to handle the basic stuff here. So here we can open up a browser. So click the activities. Then we'll have a open up browser. Put it in here. What we want to do here is that we want to create a URL. And if we go down to variables and arguments, we can see that we have the in config coming in. Then we can use the URL that we configured in the config sheet. So what we do here, instead of just hard coding in the URL, we could go up here. Then we could type in the in config, parentheses, quotation marks, and then we can type the name of our key in, that was GoogleURL. And what you just need to do is say ToString, like this, because it's an object. So this one will take in the config sheet that we loaded, and it came in here as an argument, and it will load up this, and we will go to Google, like this. So we can close this one down, and we will not do anything else in the initialization. We go back to main. Then we will go into the get transaction data, because here we will load from the queue if we have put something on the queue. So go in here. This is just a stop signal from Orchestrator. Don't do nothing about that. It's just that user can send a stop signal from Orchestrator and the whole process will stop. That will not be true, so we go over here. Here there's an invoked workflow more, that's the get transaction data. If we look at the arguments, click the import arguments, we can see that we have the arguments here. The important argument that's coming out, that's the out transaction item. It will be stored into the value transaction item of the UiPath REFramework. So open up workflow here. That's where we get the transaction from the orchestrator. We will do not much, but we will mark the get transaction item. Here we have a queue name. And you can see here that it's the orchestrator queue name. That is the queue name that we configured in our config sheet. So it will load the value of the orchestrator queue name. That's handy. We can do nothing here. So we'll just leave the get transaction data as it is. We can start our UiPath REFramework workflow. So if we just click run file, here we can see that we open up Google and the REFramework ended. That was nice. We used the config sheet to get the Google address. Let me close this one down again. So if we go back to the init, we could choose to automate in all sorts of other browsers, but it's fine with the Internet Explorer for this time. So go back to main. Now we covered the initialization and the get transaction data. So what we'll need to say here is that we will need to find out what transition this one goes to. So this one looks at Orchestrator. Do we have data on Orchestrator? No? Then we'll go over here. Remember, if we go back to Orchestrator and queues, that will be the capitals. We have nothing here, so this one just ended. However, we could try to put something on the queue so we can process our transactions. Usually you will split these two things up in a dispatcher and a performer. The dispatcher that will add to the queue, and then this is the performer. So what I'll recommend here is that we will create another workflow that will add to the queue. So I will just open up another UiPath instance like this. And we will just take a normal workflow. So process here, we could call this dispatcher. Again, these two important topics are the dispatcher and performer that will be covered in our Udemy course. You can find the link below. So then just click create. Here, let me expand it a bit, because now we will add to Orchestrator. This one will be a simple workflow. Let me expand it more and open it. So I'll read the data. I'll store my data here on the desktop. That's just called data. And we can see that the column names was idea and name. Let's try to add both things to the queue, both idea and name, even though we just need name. So let me close this one down again. Go to the dispatcher here. So first we will read from the Excel. So I'll find a read range, choose the one from workbook, drag it in. The workbook path, well, could go here, shift right click, copy as path. We could also store this path into the orchestrator, because that will be nice if the path changes when we, for example, move from prod to dev or another environment. But we will just keep it simple for now, but that could be an exercise for you. So we can say str path here, just paste it in like this. Then in the workbook path, I will say str path. We'll read sheet 1. Let me delete this range like this. Where will we read the range to? That will be a data table. So go over here, Control K, and call this dt data. Now we read it into a data table. So we will have a for each row like this. We can drag it in. So for each row in this data table, like that. And what do we want to do? We want to add to the queue. So add queue item, put that in. Here we will need to specify some things. We will need to specify the queue name. So Control K, str, queue name. we will go down to variables, and for the queue name, we could specify the queue name. That was capitals in quotation marks like this. So we will add to the capitals queue. Then we can specify what item informations we want to. So click up here in the item information collection. It'll create some arguments. So here we can call the first thing idea. The direction will be in, that's fine. It will be a string. Usually just keep everything in strings unless you have a reason not to. That will be the easiest thing to handle all over, then just convert it to integers or doubles when you need it. So the value, well, that will just be the row, that's the queue and row that we are in. The item, that is the column header. So in quotation mark, the column header was idea, then ToString. So we will add, for each row, we will add this. We will also add the corresponding name, so call it name. A string. That one will be row item name to string. Click OK. Then we can just run it. We will add our data to the queue now. Here we go into Orchestrator. Now we can either update or we can click the three dots here, view transactions. We will see that we have our 3 transactions here. We can inspect one of them, view details. We can see that we indeed have our idea and name. That was easy, right? So now we build our dispatcher. Then we can go back to our REFramework because now we can process something. Now we have new transactions on our Orchestrator queue. So we can do something here. Let's open up the process transaction. We can open up this workflow. What we wanted to do here was to get the transactions. Remember, they looked like this. They had a country in it. We want to find the capital of each transaction item. So we simply just attach our Google browser from the Internet Explorer and do the Google search. So what we need to do here is that just, let me go to main. I will go to main again because we will need to get the browser from up here. So let me run it again. And now I'll show you another important concept because now we will run it. It will just open up Internet Explorer. Nothing will happen at first sight. We are here. The REFramework will be done in a few seconds like this. And now you can think everything is well. However, we processed our queue items. That's right, we ran them through. So if we go in here, we can click View Details. We can see here that we successfully processed them. And if we update our browser here, you will see that they are now processed. That means if we run the workflow again, these one will not be processed. So we need to add them to the queue again. So let us go to the dispatcher. We can just run it again like this. We can go to the queue and now we can update it. And we can see 3 new queue items added to the queue that we can process. So let's go back. Here we go to the process transaction because now we can do something. We know we have a transaction here on the queue, so we move down here. We open it up. Here we will have a try catch again. And if you're not familiar with a try catch, well, a try catch is just, let me do this here. So we'll open up the try catch. It looks like this, and we have a try. So we try something here. And if this goes wrong, it will move down to the catches. So we can have a business rule exception. That is, if a rule is wrong, that could be data exceptions, or a system exception, that is exception. These 2 exceptions will be handled by the transition. See here, the transition will be the system exception, business exception, or success. So this try catch will just tell which transition we will go to. Let us go back to the main again and see it here. So the try catch that will produce an exception, and if it doesn't, we know it's a success, it will go up here. But let's move into the process again. So we will open up the process workflow. If we choose the import arguments, just click here, we can see which argument that is mapped. We can see here that we have the transaction item coming in and we have the config. So the in transaction item and the in config, that one will go in. And the transaction item, that was the item that we have here. So we open up the workflow. We will attach a browser. That is, we tell the UiPath that we will attach our work to a certain browser. Remember, we opened it up before. So we will attach browser, indicate the browser on the screen. So it will not be this. let me press F2. That will give us a delay. So we can go over here to the Internet Explorer. This is the browser that we want to attach. So click here. We'll click the three dots here, click Edit the Selector. It will just be the title, Google, that's fine. So then we'll click OK. So now we attached it. Then we can do the operations. The first thing that we'll do, because we'll process a lot of transactions, that is to make sure that we are on the front page. So find a navigate to, here, drag it in. We will just navigate to the URL specified in the config sheet again. So let's choose the in config, parentheses, Google URL, and then because it's an object, ToString, like here. Now we will type something in. So we'll say type into, and this will show you how you get data out of the transaction item. So indicate where you want to type in. That's here in the search box. We can inspect the selector again just to see if something is unique. It's not, it looks like, then we click OK. So to get something out of a transaction item, we will choose the transaction item itself. That's the incoming transaction item, dot, specific content. Then we will say name, because that was the name of our country, like this. Then we'll say ToString here. And we want to find a capital. So click plus, quotation mark, a space, and then we will say capital, like here. Now we're ready to run. So save everything, make sure we have it, and then we can run it. Here, let me close this browser down, and we will click run. The REFramework will run, and in a few seconds the Internet Explorer will open. That's here. We do the Denmark capital, USA capital, and the India capital. We could of course also have pressed enter, but now we ran a successfully REFramework, and you learned how to implement a REFramework to your own workflows as well. If you want to go more advanced, click the full REFramework guide to the left. That is 1 hour that will take you through almost everything. Also, if you want more UiPath advanced cases, click the video to the right. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get all the new UiPath stuff.